So what do you do at Bristol Community College?
Okay, so again, my official title is Consulting Psychologist. I am here at present 4 hours a week, and during that time I do a few different things. I meet with students individually who can be referred by professors, they can be referred by deans in different departments, they can be referred by career counseling, and we offer counseling services for students who are struggling with life issues. It may be related to, organization. It may be they may be a single parent and they're finding not enough time to juggle being a parent with their studies. I have come across in the short time I've been here a number of students on the spectrum, and and many of these students are very, very bright, but they're struggling with issues of organization or how to balance priorities, social issues, how to understand the perspectives of other people. So I help a lot with those issues. I also consult to the Dean of Counseling on policy issues and maybe individual cases. We also have 1 or 2 interns a year here, and I supervise the interns. So one intern just graduated, but there'll be 2 more interns starting in the fall, and I will supervise them. Haven't run any groups yet, but I would love to run some groups while I'm here. So that's a little bit about what I do here.
And with all your expertise, how would you define autism or any form of autism, seeing how there are several times of a very broad spectrum?
Well, you just nailed it on the head. It is a very broad spectrum, and anytime you have a spectrum, you go from significantly lower functioning, really debilitating, to very high functioning with very, very subtle symptoms, even crossing that spectrum into kind of typical functioning, but with just traits of the syndrome. And that's very, very common. And there's not a day goes by in my life that I don't see people who have traits of people on the autism spectrum, because many people do. I think that the major struggles for people on the spectrum kind of occur in 3 areas. They, occur socially, I think, is the big one. Oftentimes, people on the spectrum misperceive social cues. They don't know how to read nonverbal body language. Sometimes people, particularly with Asperger's, they may be very blunt in how they talk to people, and not realizing that sometimes they may offend somebody else by the comments they make. There's also cognitively, people have a certain profile when they're on this spectrum, and a lot of the people I work with are higher on the spectrum. What used to be referred as Asperger's, it's now considered high functioning autism. I personally still prefer the term Asperger's, and I think that makes more sense for a lot of people. But oftentimes people with Asperger's are very, very gifted in certain areas. Sometimes they can be geniuses in certain areas, not always. But in other areas they may be weak, or they may not just be interested. So often they hyper-focus in one particular area. So an example I think of somebody who is just in the news, John Nash, is the brilliant mathematician who was part of the movie A Beautiful Mind, based on his life. Now, in real life, he was diagnosed with schizophrenia, but if you read his biography, even if you watch the movie, he looks like a classic person with Asperger's syndrome. And he was a brilliant mathematician, but socially was very, very awkward. So the social piece is huge. The communication piece is also big with people on the spectrum. So at the lower end of the spectrum, you may have kids that are completely nonverbal. And traditionally, that's what people think of when they think of autism. They think of that lower functioning kid who's nonverbal, lives in their own world. Hans Asperger's, the person who Asperger's syndrome was named after, because he sort of first worked.
He coined the term.
No, he didn't coin the term.
Oh.
He wrote about kids with that profile. In the 1980s, Lorna Wing was a British psychiatrist, she coined the term Asperger's syndrome after Hans Asperger's.
Oh.
So, but what Hans Asperger had once said, or no, it wasn't him. Somebody said that people with autism live in their own world. People with Asperger's live in our world in their own way. And I've always loved that, and I think it's so true. Because people with Asperger's, they do live in our world, but in a very kind of quirky way. And what I found is for people with Asperger's to be successful is a couple of things. One is they really need to find their niche. And if they find something they're comfortable at and they're good in, they can really be tremendously successful. But at the same time, they often need enough social skills to get by. They need to know how to deal with colleagues, how to deal with bosses, how to deal with timelines and pressure. Those are the things that people with Asperger's, even when they're brilliant, they often struggle with. So if we can help in both those areas, they tend to be very, very successful. So it's kind of a long answer to your question.
That's fine. That's fine. It's good information. People will appreciate it. Now, you were talking about we're kind of like comparing low functioning autism to high functioning autism / Asperger's. Quickly, could you describe low functioning autism?
Sure. Kids with lower functioning autism are often nonverbal, where their verbal skills are very, very weak. Oftentimes with kids like this, and I have worked with some, they're often very visual learners, which is sometimes true even for the higher functioning people on the spectrum. But so for lower functioning kids on the autism spectrum, you often may use visual cues. So they might have, for the bathroom, they might have a series of pictures that shows them, they need to brush their teeth, they need to wash their face, they need to go to the bathroom, and they respond very, very well to those visual cues. Higher kids on the spectrum may or may not need those visual cues. Some do, some don't. But for the lower kids, and they're really, really not interested in interacting with other people. They just want to do their own thing. They often engage in repetitive play. They might like to line things up. They might like...
We're talking about low functioning.
Low functioning autism, thank you. Yeah, they might like to line up cars.
But this is like all throughout the spectrum. People will have repetitive.
That's true. Yeah, absolutely true. With people lower on the spectrum, they're kind of doing it just by themselves. People higher on the spectrum, they may do it just by themselves, but oftentimes their sort of obsessive things turns into, so for a kid lower on the spectrum, if they're interested in cars, they might line up their cars, or they might categorize them. Person higher on the spectrum, while they might do that, they might also be interested in learning every fact about cars, and they might be able to tell you about every model, every make, and they tend to be a wealth of information. But they that might be all they talk about. So it might be they might have a wealth of information, but other people might eventually get bored, and that's one of the things that people higher on the spectrum need to learn about, is when somebody's getting bored, how to talk about things that interest other people. People lower on the spectrum, we might just be working on getting them to say hello, getting them to say goodbye, getting them to ask, can I play with you? So there tend to be qualitative different, although there are a lot of similarities, there are qualitative differences.
Okay.